The war you are watching is not only a war, it is a monetary event, it is an oil event, it is a bond market event, it is a currency event, and if you are still looking at it only through missiles, speeches, and maps, then you are staring at the surface of the thing while the deeper mechanism is already moving underneath you. That is where people get hurt, because the public is always shown the dramatic layer first. A president threatening a nation, a deadline on television, tankers slowing, oil jumping, stocks slipping, Bitcoin wobbling. That is enough to create emotion. It is not enough to create understanding. And understanding is the only thing that gives an ordinary person a chance to stand outside the trap before it closes. So let me begin as plainly as I can. The real question is not whether this war is dangerous. Of course it is dangerous. The real question is what kind of opportunity a crisis like this creates for the people closest to money, policy, and power. That is the question too few people ask because it sounds impolite, conspiratorial, or simply too cynical for polite conversation. But history is not polite. Every major crisis eventually gets used, sometimes by design, sometimes by opportunism, usually by a blend of both. A crisis breaks the old logic. Then someone steps forward and says, since the old logic has broken, we need a new system. That is how power upgrades itself, not only through force, through emergency, through necessity, through the language of rescue. That is the deeper theme running through the source you gave me, and it deserves to be examined very carefully. Because if you follow the chain honestly, this is not only a story about Iran, oil, and the Strait of Hormuz. It is a story about the dollar, about debt, about who holds that debt, about what happens when those holders no longer want to hold it under stress, and about what kind of monetary architecture might be built next if the old one can no longer carry the strain. That is the real story, not just war system transition. That is why I want to begin with a number, not a missile count, not a troop count, a balance sheet number, America S-net international investment position. Most people have never heard that phrase, which is unfortunate because it matters far more than the average headline economist wants to admit. It tells you in simple terms how much of your country as financial world is owned by outsiders relative to how much of theirs you own, and in the source, that number is shockingly bad, deeply negative, close to 90% of GDP by the framing in the source. Now, you do not need to become an accountant to understand what that means. It means the rest of the world owns an extraordinary amount of your paper, your stocks, your bonds, your treasuries, your claims, your financial furniture. That matters in normal times. It matters much more in stress because the people who own your assets are also the people who can sell your assets when they urgently need cash. And if they all start needing the same kind of cash at the same time, the situation becomes fragile very quickly. That is what makes this war economically explosive. The countries and regions most exposed to an energy squeeze from a Hormuz closure are also the places sitting on massive piles of dollar assets. They still need oil. Oil is still priced in dollars. If energy stress intensifies, they need dollars fast. And how do foreign governments, central banks, and institutions get dollars quickly? They sell what they can sell. Treasuries, dollar assets, liquid paper. That is the pressure point. This is one of the most elegant and dangerous parts of the argument in the source. People keep talking about the war as though it is only an external threat. But for the United States, the real danger may be the way the war forces foreigners to use the very assets they accumulated over years of dollar dependence against a structure that made that dependence possible in the first place. That is a serious problem. Because once foreign holders sell treasuries, yields rise, and once yields rise, the entire American debt problem changes character. This is the part ordinary people do not feel until it is already expensive. A government with nearly $40 trillion of debt does not experience higher yields as some abstract market adjustment. It experiences them as a compounding threat to the whole fiscal structure. More expensive debt service, larger deficits, more issuance, more upward pressure on yields. A feedback loop, a spiral. That is why the source S debt-death spiral language is not melodrama. It is a structural warning at some point. borrowing costs do not merely become uncomfortable. They begin making the existing stock of debt meaningfully harder to carry without changing the rest of the policy response. That is when the system stops being stable and starts being reflexive. The more trouble there is, the more debt gets issued. The more debt gets issued, the more yields rise. The more yields rise, the more trouble there is. This is the kind of loop that can look manageable for a while right up until the moment it becomes politically and financially obvious all at once. That is why I pay so much attention to the 10-year Treasury. Not because it is glamorous, because it is one of the cleanest places to observe when the carrying cost of America begins moving from background problem to frontline threat. When yields push into the danger zone, the entire system starts repricing around them: housing, corporate borrowing, consumer finance, bank balance sheets, equity valuations, government financing, all of it. Now, the source frames three broad paths from here, and whether you agree with every detail or not, the framework is useful. Path one is the let the market do what it wants. Path yields rise, treasuries sell off, borrowing gets more expensive, housing weakens, stocks weaken, tax receipts weaken, the economy begins cracking under the weight of higher financing costs and a debt stock too large to sit comfortably in that environment. This is the honest path in one sense. It lets price clear, it lets the pain surface. It lets the market reveal what was only ever viable under easier money, but honesty is often politically unbearable, because a cleansing spiral is still a spiral. And when the debt is already this large, even letting the market work stops sounding like discipline and starts sounding like national self-harm. That is why I do not think policymakers will choose it for long, if stress becomes acute. Path two is the much more familiar one. Print cap yields absorb the damage with the central bank. Do what governments in over-indebted systems almost always do when faced with the choice between explicit pain now and delayed pain later. Choose delayed pain later and call it stability. This is where the source becomes especially interesting because it distinguishes between two kinds of quantitative easing. That distinction matters more than most people understand. There is the kind that largely stays inside the financial system, repairing bank balance sheets, swapping bad assets for cleaner central bank reserves, fixing plumbing without directly flooding households and non-banks with immediate purchasing power. Then there is the kind that expands outward into the real economy, where newly created money becomes someone's deposit, someone's balance, someone's spending capacity, someone's liquidity. That second form is much more inflationary. And if it arrives into a world where oil is already surging because of war, the inflationary consequences can be worse than the public is prepared to imagine. This is the crucial point. Printing into a recession is one thing. Printing into an oil shock is another. If energy is already pushing up prices and the state decides it must suppress yields and finance itself through renewed liquidity creation, then the inflation that follows can be far more violent than the soothing rhetoric around market support. Suggests that is why stagflation becomes the real specter and the source, not just slowdown. Not just inflation, both the kind of environment that punishes people twice, first through rising daily costs, then through a slowing economy that makes income, jobs, and asset values more fragile. That is one of the ugliest combinations in economics because it strips away the usual escape routes. If inflation is high but growth is strong, some people can run faster. If growth is weak but prices are calm, policy can ease more safely. If both go wrong together, everybody becomes more trapped. That is why the source treats printing into an oil spike as such a dangerous choice, not because the state has another good option, because the least bad option can still be disastrous in downstream consequences. Now the third path is the one that sounds deceptively simple. Retreat, back away, declare some version of mission accomplished or limited engagement, and try to step off the stage before the full economic damage arrives. But this path carries a different cost. Not only economic civilizational reserve, currency cost, prestige cost, empire cost. If the United States cannot secure the flow route that underwrites the oil system and then retreats visibly, the world learns something important. It learns that American military and monetary dominance are more negotiable than the old script insisted. That matters, because empires do not lose reserve privilege only through spreadsheets. They lose it when the world starts doubting the force behind the spreadsheet. That is why the source S reference to a Suez moment matters. Empires crack in public when the world sees that the old guarantees no longer bind the way they used to. And once that belief begins spreading, behavior changes. If other states begin concluding that the United States can no longer guarantee the order that made dollar invoicing feel natural, then the incentive to price oil and trade in other arrangements grows stronger, not overnight, but structurally. And that is how the foundations of reserve status erode, one confidence adjustment at a time. This is why I think the source is strongest, when it stops treating the war as a mere geopolitical event and starts treating it as a test of the monetary order. That is exactly right. The war matters because it forces the system to choose which failure it prefers: higher yields and debt stress, printing and inflation, or visible retreat and accelerated de-dollarization pressure. None of those are clean, none are painless, and that is precisely why the next phase becomes so important, because whenever the old system enters a period where all visible options look bad, planners and power centers begin asking a different question. What new architecture can be sold as the solution? That is the question that history keeps answering in the same direction. Crisis first, then redesign. The source uses examples people already know: 2008 and quantitative easing, 2020 and the language of reset, coordination, and emergency transformation. You do not need to believe in one smoky room full of 12 men planning every chapter in advance to see the larger truth. Crises open doors. The people closest to the hinges usually push hardest. That is what centralization is. Not always a master plot, often a repeated pattern in which moments of stress create permission for systems that would have sounded intolerable in calmer times. That is why I take the second half of the source seriously. It asks what problem the planners are really trying to solve next. And the answer it gives is not one problem, but two: the debt problem and the AI problem. That pairing is more insightful than many people will realize at first glance. The debt problem is obvious enough. The United States has issued enormous quantities of obligations and needs a larger, more stable, more distributed base of buyers. The old foreign buyers may be less reliable. The old reserve logic may be weakening. The carrying cost is rising. So the question becomes, who will hold the debt next? The AI problem is subtler but just as consequential. If AI and automation make large parts of human labor less necessary or less well compensated, then the political system inherits a legitimacy problem. How do you keep consumption stable? How do you keep people integrated? How do you prevent technological abundance for capital from becoming social and political instability for everyone else? That is the second problem, and the source S answer, or at least its theory of the answer, is elegant in a dark way. You fuse the solutions. You build a digital financial system that distributes state liabilities through private platforms while also becoming the mechanism through which income support, benefits, rewards, or some form of universalized digital purchasing power can be directed to populations whose labor market role is weakening. That is the theory. Not money printing in the crude old way, only monetary distribution through platformized wallets, debt privatized, distributed, embedded. This is where stablecoins, corporate wallets, digital payments, and a CBDC-style control architecture all begin pointing in the same direction. This is not a random technology story. It is a debt distribution story. It is a control story. And once you see that, a lot of strange little legislative and corporate developments start looking less random. The Genius Act in the source is important, not because every clause is destined to rule the world tomorrow, but because it points toward a very specific kind of structure. Corporate issuers of stable digital dollars backed by treasuries or equivalent safe assets. That is the mechanism. A company offers a wallet. The wallet holds dollar. Linked claims. The claims are backed by government debt. The user feels convenience, rewards, speed, perhaps yield, perhaps perks. The company earns a spread, the government gets a new class of buyer for its obligations. Everybody smiles, and yet underneath the smile, something profound has happened. The debt did not disappear. It got distributed further out through private channels directly into everyday economic life. That is why the Tether example in the source matters so much. People think stablecoins are a crypto story. They are also a treasury story, a gigantic treasury story. Once a dollar peg token must sit on top of treasury-backed reserves, the token becomes a distribution mechanism for government debt. Now imagine that logic no longer confined to one crypto company. Imagine it attached to Apple, to Amazon, to Tesla, to airlines, to retail ecosystems, to payment apps, to the platforms people already trust, already use, already open 10 times a day without thinking. That is when the system becomes interesting in the most dangerous possible way, because then it no longer feels like monetary innovation. It feels like convenience. And convenience is the favored costume of soft control. The public does not usually resist what arrives through speed, discounts, rewards, and better user experience. That is why I am far less interested in formal labels like CBDC than in function. You do not need to call it a central bank digital currency if the practical result is the same. Programmable money, conditional access, traceable balances, sanctionable behavior, freeze capacity, rules embedded into the channel rather than merely imposed after the fact. That is the real issue, not the branding, the function. And the source is right to point out something important here. This is not theoretical. Pieces of the model already exist. Accounts can be frozen, addresses can be blocked, transactions can be controlled. If the entire next layer of monetary life is routed through large private platforms beholden to state regulation, then the line between private convenience and public control becomes thinner than most people will be comfortable admitting. That is the control grid argument. And it is not crazy in the way people use that word to avoid thinking. It is structurally plausible. Now, let me say something important. I do not think the people closest to power are always solving the same problem. The public thinks they are solving. The public says, how do we make payments smoother? How do we modernize money? How do we help the unbanked? How do we distribute aid more efficiently? Fine, all of those may be part of the selling language. The deeper system question is different. How do we create a channel that can absorb and distribute us debt at global scale while retaining enough programmability and legal reach that the state and the large corporate partners remain inside the control loop? That is the more serious question. And if AI is also eroding labor bargaining power at the same time, then digital wallet infrastructure becomes even more attractive to planners. Now they can distribute support through the same system that holds the debt, monitors the user, conditions access, and standardizes compliance. That is why the source links AI, UBI, stablecoins, and war-driven monetary transition together. Not because they are identical issues, because they may be solved through a convergent architecture. That is the real insight. Now, there is an old pattern here too. Power does not usually centralize by saying, we would now like more control. It centralizes by saying, the old world is too dangerous, too unstable, too fragmented, too inefficient. Here is the safer system. That is how empires sell upgrades. That is how emergency law works. That is how monetary change works. That is how frightened populations accept what calmer populations would resist. So the next question becomes, if this is the direction of travel, what does an ordinary intelligent person do? This is where I want to be much more careful than many dramatic commentators are. I do not believe in theatrical all-or-nothing answers. I do not think the path is to run screaming into the woods with a sack of silver and a romantic monologue about tyranny. Nor do I think blind trust in the new digital architecture is wise simply because it will be wrapped in convenience. The first principle is still the old principle. Ownership matters, control matters, and complexity that serves someone else's system more than your own freedom should be approached with suspicion. That is why I understand the source's preference for self-custody in certain categories. Gold in your own possession is not the same thing as a claim on gold. Bitcoin held directly is not the same thing as an ETF claim routed through institutional layers. Cash in physical form is not the same thing as programmable money sitting inside a system that can be updated over a weekend. These are not ideological distinctions only. They are control distinctions, and control distinctions matter more in transition periods than in calm ones. Now, I am not telling you to put everything outside every system. That is not intelligent either. The world is more mixed than that, but I am telling you to think in terms of layers. What part of your life is fully dependent on digital permission? What part of your wealth exists only as a claim mediated by institutions whose incentives may change under stress? What part of your savings sits inside assets that can be inflated away, frozen, or quietly turned into part of someone else's debt distribution solution? These are adult questions. And the source is right about one more thing. Understanding itself is an asset. A complicated system is often designed not just to function, but to exhaust the curiosity of the people living inside it. If they stop asking what it really is, they become easier to move. That is why I care so much about making structure visible. Not because I enjoy paranoia, because invisible architecture always favors the architect. Now let me bring this to the simplest possible conclusion. The war may or may not end soon. The oil route may reopen quickly or slowly. The exact yield threshold that breaks confidence may be a little higher or a little lower than the source argues. The exact legislative path for stablecoins, digital wallets, and CBDC. Like systems may differ in timing or branding. Fine. Those are specifics. They matter, but they are not the heart of the argument. The heart of the argument is this. A crisis is approaching or intensifying inside the existing dollar system. The old debt structure is under more strain than the public wants to admit. Foreign holders are less comfortable than they used to be. War accelerates the pressure. Printing solves one problem by worsening another. And the next architecture, most attractive to planners, is one that distributes debt control and payments through digital channels embedded in everyday life. That is the real move. Not only save the dollar, replace the way the dollar reaches you. That is a much more consequential ambition. And if that ambition succeeds, the ordinary person may wake up one day feeling as though the world simply modernized around him, when in fact the underlying relationship between money, control, and sovereignty has changed far more than he noticed. That is why this matters. And that is why I would rather sound slightly early than slightly late. Because once a system like that becomes normal, it will not arrive with a drum roll announcing itself as domination. It will arrive with a discount, a yield, a convenience feature, and a smile. That is how modern control is sold. And if you know that in advance, you have a chance to build a life with enough real assets, enough local resilience, enough optionality, and enough private control that you do not have to walk blind into the next monetary cage simply because it was packaged as innovation.